Oh, hey, calling the fire in.
Where are we?
I think we're in La Roche-Guyon.
La Roche-Guyon, which is in France.
Somewhere, yeah.
Calling Chris Anderson in La Roche-Guyon also.
This is Chris Anderson in La Roche-Guyon. Calling the fire in La Roche.
Fantastic. This is a beautiful place behind us. Is it your vacation home?
It is. I was, working on a nice library. Space for my book.
Excellent.
Somebody else lives here too.
Tell us what the significance of this place is.
Well, other than being a gorgeous castle in an immaculate setting, the chateau at La Roche-Guyon was Erwin Rommel's headquarters before the Normandy landings, and before that, our friend Thomas Jefferson visited here when he was Minister to France. But mostly it's known for Erwin Rommel's and the Normandy story.
And I want to give a shout out to Ace History Happy Hour cameraman Matt Broggie in his first appearance as a History Happy Hour cameraman. And Matt, can you give us a pan over and see the house if you haven't already done it?
I've done it.
Oh man, Matt is on top of it. He's awesome. Well, Chris, today we're going to do our D-Day Masterclass special. So, what the heck does that mean?
That means it's hours and hours of 4 historians, not 2.
Wow.
BSing about history and answering the questions from our guests on the Normandy Masterclass trip.
Right, so this is discussions that we had at night after we would be traveling out to various beaches, 3 or 4 of which were Canadian. I think 1 was American or something like that. And we had some good conversations, and some of it may be deep dive, a little esoteric, but I think some really interesting stuff, and I think you will enjoy it. Can you just briefly introduce our other 2 historians?
Well, we were joined by Hugh Buchanan, who's a dear friend of mine and a Blue Badge guide in London. And Hugh and I have worked together on a number of things, one of which is our upcoming Battle of Britain tour. And historian, photographer extraordinaire, Matt Broggie, is another good friend of ours, expert on Utah Beach and 7th Corps on D-Day, and also a Stephen Ambrose guide, so he joins us.
We're going to be doing Band of Brothers, I think.
And we'll be doing Band
so
of Brothers.
fantastic. We're not letting him on camera now, but he will get on camera later.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I think that we have, hopefully there's a few of you watching out there. I think we have killed enough time, so take it away.
Oh, wow.
Hi everybody, and thanks for joining us here.
Hi, Hugh. Hi.
In the lobby of the Churchill Hotel in Bayeux.
Lovely downtown Bayeux.
We're here on the Normandy Masterclass Tour. We've all had a great day visiting the scenes of action of the Canadian troops at D-Day. And we're here to take questions that you might have. It could relate to today, or it could simply relate to questions that you have about D-Day that you think would be good conversation starters.
I have a general question. The intelligence that was available to our people, to the Americans, to the whole thing, in conjunction with the bocage, why weren't our infantry trained to fight in the bocage when they were in England?
So, as far as the bocage country, Eisenhower says after the war that it was the Allies' greatest failure. Okay. There is no clear answer because they were aware of the bocage. Because, as you know, if you've been to Aldbourne with me, they trained. There were hedgerows there. No, not as big as Normandy, but they understood that kind of terrain existed. I think they just didn't take it seriously enough, and I think part of the reason for that is they were so focused on just getting ashore that other things that might happen, they're like, well, we'll deal with that when we get to it. But right now we've just got to land. But I don't think there was any willful decision to neglect it. They were certainly aware, and even if they hadn't trained in hedgerows, they had photographs. They knew, right? I just think it was one thing first, and then we'll move on. But that's just my opinion. So I don't know if anybody else has got a theory.
I've always felt that way too, that the practicality of moving deeper into Normandy was dramatically overshadowed by establishing the foothold on the beaches, and then the second mile from the beaches. And then they ran into the hedgerow fiasco, and then they had to deal with it on the fly, which is why you see the adaptation of the Sherman tanks with the hedgerow forks, whatever you want to call
Rhino.
it. The Rhino.
Right.
Yeah.
And
they had to develop it on the fly. Yeah.
I want to just speak to the Rhino and speak to the way the American forces are organized. They have a problem. The leaders don't know how to solve it, so they essentially put the word out to people, who can come up with an answer. And it's literally a Sergeant Cullen, who comes up with the answer of putting the Rhino on, and he's the guy. It's like, we're going to be a democratic army. We're not just going to mandate something from the top down, whether it works or not. We're going to ask the people who know what they're doing, and they succeed in making that happen.
Well,
so that's how they solve the problem.
Well, in addition to that, the problem gets so bad, and it's kind of humorous that Eisenhower down to Bradley they get back to Washington, like, we need as many bulldozers as you could get your hands on. You got to send us bulldozers because we got to get through this, and just the chain of bureaucracy involved in that. By the time they resolved it, of course, Cullen has said, "Hey, we've got all these obstacles that have been left on the beach. Let's chop them up." So, yeah.
It's worth pointing out that not all the internal geography was bocage.
Right.
One of the things we've
Absolutely.
been seeing today, those broad open chalk landscapes, they thought was going to be classical tank country.
Right.
Monty produced the phrase at the briefing at St Paul's. He says, "I'm going to hang around a bit there." He thought he might be on the verge of a tank breaker through this open country. Additionally, I'd like to endorse what the others have said. If you look at the big dress rehearsals and exercise, like Operation Fabius, for example, all focus on the amphibious landings. And thereafter, I think they thought we were just getting clept into what they thought was classical military tactics and strategy.
Number two, I guess if nobody else.
We'll let Marcus ask number 2, and then we're going to go to other people and then come back to you again.
Well, I got about 6. But the point.
Keep going.
Why weren't the paratroopers trained in flooded fields, or were they?
Well, because they were trained to land on drop zones. You're not going to risk highly trained paratrooper by saying, "We're going to drop you in a pool, hope you make it out, and then you'll learn how to." Look, those flooded fields. First of all, again, a lot of them they didn't notice because of the way the photographs were going. They certainly thought they'd been promised that they're going to drop these paratroopers where they need to be dropped, and we know these airfields are, and I think that would have been a bit excessive to say.
Do we have somebody else who wants to put a question up there?
How did they settle on the plan of using 5 beaches? Did they discuss, let's use 3 beaches, 2 beaches, 6 beaches? How did they end up settling on the plan that they ended up going with?
So who gets to start? You.
The original plan was for 3 beaches, and when Eisenhower and Monty were appointed to their respective positions, they both come to a similar conclusion at the same time. He hasn't got enough punch. They're concerned you only use 3 beaches and you can't play your trump card. And your trump card is to establish a broad beachhead and then pour as much material and men as you possibly can in there, because that's what industrialized economies with empires will resort to doing. Play their trump card. In addition to that, I think one of the comments that Montgomery made was, look, if we're going to use just 3 beaches to pour all that material through, that is going to be one heck of a log jam. So they needed more width. And Chris used a very good phrase earlier on in the tour. I think when we're talking about Sword Beach, he's talking about the need to have elbow room so you can deploy your forces. And 2 other reasons, I think. First of all, that elbow room means trying to get across the Pegasus bridges of the high ground the other side. And I think it also means that one of the reasons that Utah Beach was chosen was to have a crack at getting hold of Sherborne and transforming that into a usable deep sea water port.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I have to because it involves my great hero, which is Frederick Morgan.
Yeah.
Okay, and so Frederick Morgan is the man who planned Stephen, and if there's one person whose hand is on every aspect of that, it's Morgan's. And so Morgan is given the job of planning the invasion, and he's going to be given the command of the chief of staff to the Supreme Allied Commander. So he's the number 2 for a man who doesn't exist yet. And part of the reason he gets the job is it plays into the whole British versus American. There's a lot going on there. But anyway, he's given the job largely because the British want to keep the Americans happy. And when he's given his remit, he's told to plan the invasion, and Alan Brooke says, it's not going to work, but just make it look like it's going to work. So he has to plan the greatest military operation in history. He doesn't know how many men he's going to have, what equipment he's going to have. He doesn't have a staff. He has no command authority.
He's developing plan B and C at the same
Right,
time.
and he's also planning fortitude. He's planning for an emergency landing in Europe if the Nazi government falls apart. All of this, but he has no authority or resources. So he basically proactively says, okay, I think they say we might have about 100,000 men, but we're not sure. All things considered, in a perfect world, let's look at the possible landing sites, and there's certain things he wants and doesn't want, and then you have things like tide and all these other factors that come into play. And really, as long as that coastline is, the kind of the amazing thing is the only places that really look like they might be suitable are Pas-de-Calais, which has its problems, and Normandy. So, given the resources he thinks he can muster, he says, well, I have enough for 3 beaches and 1 airborne division. And then, of course, Montgomery and Eisenhower come on board. And what I find very interesting is Montgomery, in true Montgomery fashion, says, I reviewed the plan and it was an unsound operation of war, so I had to replan everything. Which rightly incenses Montgomery and his staff. And Eisenhower agrees with Montgomery, obviously. But he later says, no, it's Morgan's plan, but I realized that we could add to it. So that's where you get the 2 additional beaches.
Was there ever any consideration of a 6th beach? I've read that there might have been something called Band Beach that would have been
Or
added to
Baitfish
this.
Beach, I think. Yeah. Just the other side on the eastern side of the mouth of the river Orme. You came in by ferry. I've looked at the left-hand side of the ferry. It is coming into the Ouistreham terminal at low tide. We'll see this vast, great beach with mudflats at the bottom of it. I think there are 2 reasons they didn't pick it. One is the problem of the mudflats providing a soft surface. I think the other one is just a question of resources. It would have taken an enormous amount of resource, another perhaps division, to go ahead and land on that beach. And I think it just wasn't there.
Why didn't they use the MRAP, whatever the Marines had in the Pacific that could go right in the shore versus landing craft going and then jumping out over your head almost?
Well, one thing that I find interesting that I read recently is I think there was something like 300 Amtrak's amphibious vehicles that they had at their disposal that they could have used, and I don't know if it's Bradley or someone who works for Bradley who basically says, no, we're going to do this our own way. There's definitely a bias on the part of Omar Bradley against kind of listening to anybody outside their command. And in fact, General Joe Collins has fought in the Pacific. He comes to the ETO to take part in the invasion, and he's got ideas. Here's how we did it in the Pacific, and he writes about this and says nobody seemed to care. They seem to be like, oh, well, that's nice, in your little Pacific invasion, but this is the big one, and the big boys will handle it. And there seems to be a certain amount, from what I've looked at, of kind of just stubbornness there. I don't know if there's another part to that answer.
Yeah, I agree with that, and you'll see when you go to Utah Museum or not. But there is an LVT that came ashore several LVTs that came ashore at Utah, and one of them is in the Utah Museum. I think it was ultimately the Higgins boat was the tool of choice by this point. I think, like Rich says, there is inter-service bias and rivalry. The LVT is more of a marine thing, and I think the wooden hulled Higgins boat, the LCVP, is what the Army has been used to and what they're being trained with, so they don't alter the plan for D-Day for that reason. Yeah.
So it's very interesting, just as an aside, very, very recently, and Hugh, you might have heard about this, in the past year and a half, there's a guy in England, somewhere in southern England, and he found an LVT that had just been pushed into a hole. So clearly it had been sent over prior to the invasion, and clearly it wasn't used, and it sat around somewhere in southern England, and they just said, well, we're not going to use it, and they stuffed it into a hole, buried it. And of course, this guy found it, and all the newspapers were like, tank has been found. It's not a tank, it's an LVT that they just decided not to use, which is crazy.
Yeah, they should have. I think they absolutely should have.
Well,
They
we should have machine guns on it or something. 'Cause
Exactly.
The field of the guy dropping gate, and they're
Yeah,
wide open, and then
because the LVT doesn't have that. It's over the side on an LVT.
Yeah. Well,
and that's against, really at this point, against what they've been training for so long. It's a whole different tactic of establishing yourself ashore. And the Army doesn't like changing things. They don't like change at any point, especially months before the greatest amphibious invasion in history.
Well, this team has been working together, right? So they work together to some degree in North Africa. Bradley's involved, but certainly in Sicily, and so there's I think there's a certain amount of, hey, this is the boys, this is the old boys who've been here, and we're not really gonna accept new ideas.
Didn't they use them later on, though, to cross the Rhine, across some of the rivers?
And actually, the people that first began to use them were the British and the Canadians.
Further right?
Just in Northwest Europe. And so,
Everywhere across.
so if you look at Walcheren, so after Monty's big screw up in the autumn of 1944, they have to clear the Scheldt Estuary and Walcheren Island. The Royal Marine Commandos and the Canadians use LVTs to get gripped with the enemy. I just think it may be institutional bias. It may be the fact that the British just have more of a tradition of trying to come up with what we would call force multipliers, but they seem more adaptable to kind of new ideas and new technology.
You can see that with the funnies. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
It's an element to that question, sorry, relating to whether you're using funnies on American beaches as well.
Absolutely.
Perhaps there's a logistical element behind that. You know, you're asking forgive me, American troops to use Churchill tanks, all the supply, the refitting, the replenishment of kit. I'm not sure they would have the pipeline to supply that. I'm not sure the British would have the resources to go ahead and produce that. So maybe there's a logistical element.
I think there's an element of that, but I think it's also kind of laziness, because I think once the design had been come up with, if Eisenhower or Marshall or somebody had embraced flail tanks or LVTs, or you could have modified a Sherman just like,
and you could just go and license it out.
Yeah, I just think it's an unwillingness to.
It's interesting though, because you have an unwillingness to adapt and improvise there essentially, but a willingness to do so with the Rhino, which I guess is born because, oh my God, we have a crisis, we have to do something.
That's born out of a crisis.
and that was also born out of American ingenuity, I think, which is the difference too. They adapted it, they came up with it, it's their idea, and so they're more likely to accept it and deploy it in the field.
But I think the larger issue is, again, a willingness on the part of the American Army High Command to just
try something new.
Just to open up their minds to the possibility that maybe we should take some of the lessons learned in the Pacific and apply them. I mean, that's the logical one, right? We've had several assault landings in the Pacific, albeit performed by generally the Marines, but you could say, hey, you guys know a little bit about getting your feet wet. What do you think? And there's none of that.
Between the 2 years of amphibious landings in the Pacific to June 6, 1944. And as far as they could say, there was nothing that they knew of. It's two separate worlds.
Well, and it's interesting because one of the historians is Craig Simons, who's the dean of scholars, particularly when it comes to naval forces in Normandy. And he said in a lot of ways, the people in the Pacific were more receptive to lessons that they learned in Europe, which I hadn't heard before. But he says he'd come across evidence of Pacific Island commanders, both Marine and Army, going, well, what did they do in Europe and how? So they would adapt, but the other way, not around. And I think personally, a lot of that's down to Bradley.
I would add that for the Overlord landings, they didn't even follow the experience of the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
Where you did nighttime landings and, to try to achieve surprise. Pacific, they couldn't do that and so the answer was far more naval gunfire.
Well, I think
They didn't do either.
That's a very good point, but I think one of the things that is kind of interesting and may have spooked them is one of the sense I get as these people are planning this, all the services, the senior commanders are really overwhelmed by the immensity of what's going to happen. So I think there's immediately a sense of this is it. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is the moment of decision. And everybody wants to ensure that their particular task succeeds. So that's where you have that great internal debate. Like you said, Coda said absolutely wants to land at night. He's like, why the hell aren't we landing at night? But then the Navy can kind of say, well, then because the landing craft can't see the beach obstacles. But then the Air Force is like, well, then we can't bomb the beach. So I think that's also plays into it, right? The Navy doesn't want to say, like, well, we should. So what you get for a landing time and process is a decision by committee, pretty much, with all the inherent problems with that. Coach?
This is kind of hypothetical. After we invade and we break out of Normandy, how would things have been different if we'd have headed to Berlin?
Well, we were headed to Berlin.
I'm talking about if we concentrated on going straight to Berlin and getting there before the Russians.
Come on, tell me.
First of all, I'll start. You can think about it while I'm
I think you're putting your finger on rather a thorny problem here, which is certainly Montgomery was peddling the idea of a concentrated punch going through to Berlin and putting oil resources behind that, rather than what he saw as a general strung-out army policy. If that's what you're talking about, there's a lot we can talk about.
I was just interested in that. Was that something, an alternative that they could have done? Maybe if you capture the capital, it ain't long before the country falls behind it.
One, I would add that I think what you need to understand too is you will probably read about the American way of war or the German way of war. Countries just kind of traditionally and doctrinally have methods or ways that they like to fight. So 2 things to that point. One is Eisenhower's orders were not to capture Berlin. His orders were that you will enter the continent of Europe and destroy the Germans' ability to wage war, and you'll destroy the German army. Nowhere in there does it say you're going to capture the capital. So traditionally, for the Americans, you win wars by destroying your opponent's military forces.
Center of gravity.
Right, not
Going back to the Civil War.
right, going back to the Civil War. So I don't think that ever would have occurred might be too strong, but that's just not the way we do things, basically. It would have taken a totally rejiggering of the plan. And also, if Eisenhower were one day to say, okay, we're going to have a single thrust, well, the person who's the big advocate of the single thrust is Montgomery. And by that point, there's no American general on God's green earth that would have agreed to support Montgomery in that kind of thing. But anyway, that's...
I mean, and this will be the last thing I'll say on that. I was just curious on what y'all's reaction was. Because everybody at the time knew what Stalin was up to.
Right.
It's kind of like being a football coach. You look at who your opponent is now, but you're also looking at who your opponent is next Friday night.
Right. Well, I mean, I would simply add to that because Eisenhower gets a lot of grief just after the war about, well, you gave Eastern Europe to Stalin. And some of you may have heard me say this, but there's a wonderful moment. There's a press conference at some point, late 40s, early 50s. And Eisenhower's kind of getting grilled about his decision not to advance on Berlin. And Eisenhower finally says, all right, stop. I want anybody in this room who was willing to sacrifice their son, their father, or a husband for a purely political target to please stand up.
That's good. With also the Pacific.
Right.
Because we have to fight the Pacific.
So at that point, Eisenhower knows he has to destroy the German army. The Red Army loses somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 men just for the honor of taking Berlin. And Eisenhower, I think rightly, is not willing to pay that price to have a victory parade in Berlin.
I think what you're asking can be seen perfectly in the example of Market Garden. That's the exact plan. It's a narrow punch to capture Berlin by Christmas. And look what happened with Market Garden. So if that was done from the beaches, it'd be, I think the issues and all the problems we saw with Market Garden would be exacerbated greatly.
You guys as historians, you guys probably know Operation Overlord better than anybody I know. Is there anything you would have done different knowing what you know now? Would you change the operation? Would you do something different because of what you know?
Change is hard to get through. It's real hard to do.
Well, you want to do this right to left, left to right, or?
That's a tough one, I hope.
Oh, that's easy. That's really easy.
Oh, it's easy for Matt, so we're gonna let Matt go.
Well, number one, yeah.
Don't change.
Shore drenching, you bombard the shore, especially Omaha Beach, for
even more than they did.
For more than half an hour. Yeah, absolutely. You take, that's one lesson you take from the Pacific. I mean, even in the Pacific, it didn't have that great of effect as we've seen, on Iwo Jima, for example. They bombed it for a month plus, and the Japanese were underground, safe, ready to fight, as we've seen. So I'm saying, that's the first thing that popped in my mind. You bomb the hell out of the shore for days and days and days. Give them the best chance to get ashore with minimal resistance. Yeah. I'm sorry?
What happens to surprise if you do that?
Yeah. Then, okay, I've always wondered that too. You bring in those Panzer divisions that Schaeff and everybody else was so afraid of to and ruin the surprise and the location of D-Day, of Overlord, then you bring them within range of the naval guns. You bring them out, and you can. The Panzer generals are just as afraid as naval guns as we are of the Panzer divisions being in the location on the day.
Well, let's remember, and honestly, I'm taking Chris Anderson's point here, that we invade, and they still think that the actual invasion is going to be at Pas de Calais. So if we were bombarding for a week, again, just stealing from you, or being inspired by you, how is that going to be different? And I take Matt's point as being excellent. I mean, if the Panzer Division say, oh, they're invading here, we'll come in, then they come within range. I mean, how you might lose some surprise, that might be an issue, but I think you would gain quite a bit by the destruction of defenses, which we see time and time again, just didn't happen, and are a big reason that 4,500 people die in the 24 hours that start with H hour. 4,500 Allied soldiers and sailors.
Right, so at the end of the day, one has to point out, D-Day was a great success. Yeah, the plan worked. As far as I see it, the problems happen in the aftermath. It's the moving inland where the casualty rates rise. And I think that's where the tactical problems rise as well. I have a little problem with the the Pacific analogy. And I've heard this before, and I've thought about it. Trying to arrange a naval bombardment for several days on a coast where you're going to have variable weather quite a lot is a seriously difficult thing to do. And we know that the aerial bombardment at the same time is a deluge, but it isn't the most accurate thing in the world. And therefore, I think the issue about surprise becomes rather more important under those circumstances. I mean, I don't know how the weather patterns work in the Pacific, but if you've got set conditions, you can fasten your boats onto a coast and actually bombard a target and have the luxury of bombarding a target for 7 to 10 days or whatever. I would suggest it doesn't necessarily happen that way in the British Channel. I mean, look, for example, what happened after the heat wave finished. We had the mixed cyclonic weather that actually went with D-Day.
You guys need good politicians. What would you do different?
I would tell Hapner Arnold and Arthur Bomber Harris to sit down and shut up.
Okay.
I think the aside from the things we've been talking about Omar Bradley and not taking lessons learned and whatnot, is our greatest failure. And I would say not only for D-Day, but during the war in general, was to not force the bomber barons to understand that they're actually part of a team.
Yeah.
Because even though Eisenhower gets control of air assets for a brief window for D-Day, he doesn't really command them. And because of the intransigence, of Harris and Arnold in particular, there's no doctrine developed about really supporting the troops until it's too late. The Luftwaffe is built to support troops on the ground. That's why it's there. That's its reason. That we don't have that, and it's only very late in the game. So you look at, kind of getting back to the very first question, Utah Beach. Okay, it's added at the last minute. By that point, all the air assets have been doled out, and all they've got is the 9th Air Force. But hey, guess what? The 9th Air Force is a tactical air force. So rather than going perpendicular to the beach, they go horizontal to the beach, and it works.
At 6,000 feet instead of 15,000 feet.
It's interesting to compare the air plans for Omaha with the air plan that was conducted in Utah.
Absolutely.
Did fly
Absolutely.
and they were lower, lighter aircraft or medium
Right.
aircraft, flying at a much lower altitude.
And they eliminate the German.
Did the job.
Absolutely.
I think if I was
It's funny how the German shooting like this, but we are going like this.
One thing I think I'd focus on.
Hang on one second. Can we, I'm sorry, I know you guys are changing seats and such, but can we quiet down? Oh, it's Lynn, of course.
Go ahead.
Can I give an answer to one thing I would do differently?
Absolutely.
Many of the British troops who took part in D-Day have been training for 4 years. 4 years is some time you could get to grips actually training up a proper armoured division. As Chris says, liaising with air-to-ground strike aircraft and really trying to create the equivalent of an Allied Panzer division. And I still got my eye on what happens after the landings, which is the breakout. That sort of resource, I feel, would have been of great importance in the breakout afterwards.
I've got an answer to this question, and I'm going to get a response over here. But I would have found a way to lighten the load of the guys coming out of the landing craft and running up onto the beach. And I'll talk about this tomorrow or Thursday. But the soldiers themselves, several of them, comment, if we'd had less stuff on our backs, less stuff to bring, then our casualty rates would have been much lower. They are carrying 60, 70 pounds minimum of stuff, and they have to walk, essentially, over a quarter of a mile of beach in the middle of the heaviest gunfire they've ever seen. They can't run, they can't go very fast, and I think it hurts them. And I understand that that's basically the standard load. There's a lot of reasons why they're carrying their own food, they're carrying all the equipment that they would need, carrying equipment for fighting inland, but it doesn't do any good if you get killed before you get to the beach. And if we could have had more people in that first wave get to the beach alive, I think it would have been better for the whole invasion. Go ahead.
Moving on.
But when I look at this tape, how many faces did you make while I was talking?
I tried really hard. I just didn't look down.
I don't think that counts. No, you can. I mean,
The military does have, tactically, it used very light force, small force, and then he used a little heavier force, and then bigger, heavier behind. So there is a balance between how you do your force. You understand, the first guys, they just landed with nothing, just with a little light, right? Second guys come with some weapon, and then the bigger tanks come later. So whether or not some unit could come lighter, and then the bigger unit, I don't know. I'm not a military planner. But
I say this with as much love as possible, but Rick is full of shit. No, I mean, that's always been one of the great debates, and I think it's a false construct. You have much bigger issues going on the beach, and I mentioned this during all the tours. People ask me this question. SLA Marshall, after the war, was contracted by the Army to do a study on the history of the weight of equipment that soldiers carried. And what SLA Marshall determined was, since Marius's mule, the Roman soldier, took to the field, infantry soldiers have carried 60 to 70 pounds of shit. The shit changes, but it's 60 to 70 pounds. And I don't think that the guys that landed in the first or second wave were carrying that much more than they'd been training with carrying since they were doing field exercises in England. If you take an M1 Garand rifle, that's 11 pounds. Bayonets, another, 2? A fully loaded Garand ammunition belt is 6 or 7, 2 bandoliers, that's another 12. And 3K rations or raincoat. You're starting to approach the weight that they're saying. I think, and I'm not saying that I don't think the soldiers after the fact said I was carrying too much stuff, because what they really wanted to do was get across that beach as fast as they could. But if you get across the beach fast and you don't have equipment to tackle the objective, then you're pointless. And what I use as evidence of that is all the guys that land on the beaches and they've lost their Bangalores, and they've lost their radios, and they've lost their mine detectors, and they get to the base of the bluff, or they get to the bunker, or they get to the barbed wire belt, and they're like, okay, so now what do you do? I don't think that the weight was the factor.
Okay, so Chris, on our second night of conversation, Matt wasn't there, so it's only been 3 of us now.
Oh, okay.
And we pick it up after kind of a question comes up about something that Omar Bradley did on, or almost did, on Omaha Beach.
So one of the great questions we got was the question about Omar Bradley at Omaha Beach. At one point in his memoirs, he talks about thinking that the landings were going so bad that he was thinking about pulling the Americans off the beach. So we had a good long discussion about how close he came and what the possible impact of that decision would have been had he pulled the Americans off of Omaha Beach.
So check that part out.
How close was Bradley to making the decision? Is that
The decision to pull troops off of Omaha Beach the morning of June 6th.
So he was very, very close. In his various biographies, he says he considered pulling them off and relanding them at Sword, which never would have happened. That's just not a possibility. There are some historians, Jack Sheldon being one of them, who has said he actually had made the decision
I've heard that.
to pull the men off the beach, and he called the 8th Air Force to say, I need a mission so you can drop bombs on the beach so I can pull them off. And the 8th Air Force says, look, we've just done a bunch of missions this morning. We have to rearm. It's not going to happen right now. Which is a good thing, because if that's the version of history that you agree to, the bombers would have come back over and turned the bluffs into a parking lot just as Dawson and Spaulding were actually getting to the top of the bluffs. I think, knowing, based on my analysis of Bradley as a commander, that he was very close to doing that.
And is there evidence for this Air Force scenario that you talk about? I mean, is there
Sheldon seems to think that there is. Again, I haven't dug into the primary sources enough, but Sheldon has, and based on kind of eyewitness testimony, he says that Bradley had decided to.
And what changed in his mind after he had decided?
Well,
that the Air Force wouldn't do it.
The Air Force wouldn't do it.
That was what it was. I heard it was that he heard guys were already moving inland.
No, because the people he sends to the beach to find out what's going on report back to him and say, "Sir, it's a disaster."
Right. That is what we talked about today on the beach. The staff officer who comes back from investigating to report to Bradley and the high commanders, and he's white and shaken and says, "It's a disaster. It's confusion. It's chaos, and it's bad news."
So I think it was a very narrow thing.
And had he had done that, it could have been divide and conquer.
Well, had he done that, then, of course, Omaha Beach is over. And you can write off everybody that landed at Utah Beach because they're now 25 miles, 30 miles at that point away from.
Right, so the Germans will flow in, they'll see this right away and flow into them.
And again, right at the start of the trip, we talked about how this is all one operation and all of these beaches are linked. And
and the other factor there, Chris and Hugh, correct me if I'm wrong, or don't, as you wish, but that would also be a political issue, because then you would have, if the Omaha Beach pulls out and Utah Beach is taken, suddenly we have only British and Canadian soldiers in France, and that suddenly is going to become a political issue of sorts.
It's going to be a massive political issue. Also going to be an issue of public morale. This is the one operation that couldn't fail. And,
too big to fail.
Well, I mean, the consequences are too big to fail. And for Britain, it's the exhaustion is quite extraordinary. Scraping the barrel for troops, public morale is just tarred. I think all their domestic hopes have been staked on the successful reinvasion of a continent. I think it had been seen to fail. There'd been an enormous amount of public pressure on the Prime Minister to consider at least opting out of the war.
So imagine now, and this again gets back to why this is so important. If the landings fail, best case scenario, it's at least a year before the Allies can mount another similar sort of operation. In that year, Hitler finishes the final solution, so there are no more Jews in Europe. All of those weapons that we talk about, V1s, V2s, jets, nuclear program, he has another year to develop them.
Yeah.
He has another year to try to stop the Russians.
Yeah.
Who are now not going to get the supplies they had been getting because we've lost in Normandy. V1s and V2s are raining down on London. And the British people who've been at war since 1939 are reaching the end.
Sure. Italy's isolated.
Well, Churchill probably goes down.
Right.
Roosevelt has an election that fall. He probably loses. And you have a suit for peace.
Right, and I mean, and who's to say that Stalin and Hitler don't say, you know what, you keep your little bit of Poland, I'll keep my little bit of Poland, we'll just call it a day.
Put up a demilitarized zone.
Right. So the consequences are pretty frightening.
Mine had to do with if they did fail. Russia was doing a pretty good job of pushing them back.
Well, but there's evidence. Oh, sorry.
If they had continued their offensive and come into east side of Germany, I'm just saying I don't think it would have been as bad. Well, having the Russians take over would have been bad. Do you think the Brits would have capitulated?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there'd be very close capitulation.
And also, Kershaw, in his biography of Hitler, his 2-volume, and he's the definitive guy, he's found evidence that Stalin is trying to make overtures to, well, not in June, but August, September, is beginning to make overtures to Hitler through the Japanese. Because, again, remember, Japan and Russia are not at war, right? So, Stalin is getting what he wants on the ground, but even Stalin is starting to run out of people. So again, if you're Stalin and you're trying to make, decisions based on your own self-interest, if the Western Allies can't get it together, and they're not giving him the planes and the trucks and the bully beef cans and the boots, this may be too hypothetical. What's not to say that Stalin just says, "Look, I got plenty. We'll just take a pause." I don't think Stalin would be willing to continue the war as the only combatant. I don't think he would be willing to do that. But that's just the theory.
This really underlines the stakes involved in D-Day.
And also, this is Britain's last offensive capability.
Because they're running out of men.
Remember, so in 1944, just to plug my guys, the British are out of young men to be second lieutenants, and Canadians
Chris,
are being commissioned.
We had a great time.
We
were here on our last day,
and
we're back in France. Back in France at Rommel's headquarters, as we discussed earlier at the beginning of the show. And we talked about Thomas Jefferson visited this great chateau here. But what about next week? One of Thomas Jefferson's compatriots also visited here. And that's our show next week's about him.
Who?
Benjamin Franklin.
Wow, Mr. You are the Where's Waldo of the American War of Independence.
So we have a book that we're doing next week called Ben Franklin's Last Bet, and it's by Michael Meyer. It's a real interesting story. I want to thank Matt Broggie, who's been our cameraman. I want to thank all of our Patreon supporters. We just really appreciate you. And that's it from here.
From the party at La Roche.
I mean, they're just you cannot give these people instructions.
Going madness,
Okay.
madness. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Oh, I got to say you're right. Okay. All right. Well, you just trying to leave. What's your message for the world? I am recording.
You are.
I am.
I don't want somebody else's flipping cell phone charged in next to me.
I want people to just be respectful and not flip out for no reason.
I want juniors to pay more respect to their betters, the oldsters.
I want old people to know when their time is up and to get the hell out of the way. Clear out.
It's all serious history here, Steve.